All right. Okay, so we are here this week. I heard that the sound was in and out last week, so I'm going to try to speak up, but also I've put this other little mic in here, hoping that maybe that will help a bit. It looks like the little green microphone is a little higher than maybe it had been when we were just speaking to the sky with the mics that are above us, so hopefully. All right, so just a couple of updates. We have updated, or I have updated the syllabus a bit. This week it was supposed to be about making posters for a poster-based level forum, which we're not doing. We're doing online.
Okay.
So, so what I decided to talk about this week is something that maybe is a little bit more fun for everyone. It's definitely more fun for me, and that's about talking through international goals. Like, how do you want to engage on a global scale after you graduate? And that sort of thing. So whether that means traveling, whether it means volunteering, doing mission work, just staying engaged in terms of how do you, like, maybe putting in an RSS feed, you know, for the words like Honduras or Ghana or South Africa, and how do you sort of keep that up moving forward in life? So that's what we're going to talk about. So that is one change in the syllabus. Other things that have been updated then, I have put in the date for the final project, the final paper to be due. Our final would have been May 1st, so that's when it's due. That's when the final paper is due. And I have updated the syllabus on Carmen, so if that's something you check ever or on a regular basis, that's where you would find the most up-to-date syllabus. So, and I have adjusted as we've gone along. Now, there was an assignment technically due last night at 11:59 p.m. And that was the 5 articles to review. So I know some people, especially those who didn't necessarily watch the recording last week because they did the online exercise instead, maybe didn't quite realize that piece. So if you didn't realize that, or there was some confusing language in the syllabus, because at one point it was going to be an article due each week, but that in my mind became something sort of a little bit harder to manage, and it was sort of like, as a student, what would I have done anyway? I would have probably taken an hour or so and just trying to get it all done in a couple hours or something at one time. So if that's not something that you noticed or you didn't read into, and you're out there in the world of watching us online, send me a note, and if we need to negotiate the time frame to get things in because you didn't understand, let me know. All right, so questions from anybody in the room? Okay, well, let's jump in here. So there's a combination of things to talk about today. You guys are getting the brand new college template for PowerPoints. So this is the first one I've even seen it this big. So, and I need to share my screen. Sorry, guys, I didn't go into this correctly. For those of you out in the world, you're still seeing our faces and not the actual PowerPoint. So now you have it. So now you can see what we're talking about in terms of the new college PowerPoint template that's out there. Yeah, so the rural-urban interface is going to be something that is going to be becoming more and more important in the college, according to the dean. One of the things that, for instance, she's talked about with me is that a lot of what we're talking about in the college in terms of rural development is actually more focused on urbanizing rural areas, when really it's sort of like, how do you maintain the integrity of a rural area, like not change the nature of it and that sort of thing, to strengthen it without necessarily like urbanizing it, and then focusing not so much on like the specific, like there's impact there, or there's expanding residential areas coming out into the rural area, like the suburban areas are growing, but how do you take rural areas, like for instance Southeast Ohio, where there are food deserts, and improve them in terms of food security issues. So that's sort of becoming a little bit of a shifting focus for the college, which to some degree I think is a little bit why this slide is put out there as the cover slide for the college template. So anyway, all right, so let's go on. Okay, so just to sort of take a moment and think about it, have any of you guys ever really thought about, 5, 10 years from now, how do you want to be engaged on a global scale? Have you thought through that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what kind of things do you envision you doing?
So one of my big scale goals, I guess, and it would be probably closer to 10 years because I am doing grad school. But one thing that I really like about the Columbus Zoo and a lot of zoos is they're involved in a lot of conservation projects throughout the world. And some people, not necessarily keepers, I think it's bigger than that, but some people who work at the zoo too get to be directly involved with conservation projects abroad. So that's kind of something that I would see, I guess, like a dream to be, that if I could work at a zoo here, work with animals in captivity, and then also get to support projects abroad and then travel abroad.
Cool.
I think for me, I had two things. One, traveling abroad and just for myself, gain different perspectives. Then applying that experience to teaching in a couple of different capacities. One in the high school level, just providing students the opportunity to learn more internationally, just through the classroom, but also maybe providing them opportunities to see what they can do going to college or a career that's international as well. Then long term, maybe teaching at the college level and starting my own study abroad, something in the ag systems management programs, ag engineering, sort of realm of things.
And I have had high schools. Eric Rieger, who I don't think he's still teaching, he might be administration now,
Okay.
but he took students to both Brazil and the Dominican Republic,
Really?
places he'd studied abroad.
Wow, that would be really cool.
Yeah, like took actual high school.
I think for me, something that I can still do now is connect with my host family that's in Brazil. So if you're like WhatsApp, we still talk sometimes, which is nice. But in the 5 years realm, definitely traveling and volunteering abroad. I think it'd be really cool to work abroad, short term. So that's kind of something I'm open. Sorry. And
Yeah, so you out there in the world may have other ideas as well. So some people have their sights set on maybe doing a Peace Corps. We now have our first person doing AgriCorps, which is creating bridge programs in Ghana as well. So that's Kelsey Brown. But then we also, there's also opportunities like working for the Department of State, a process I went through maybe more than 5 years ago was the process of joining the Department of State and to be a consular to work in the embassy, like the Foreign Service. So I got all the way through and even made the list, and then the economy fell apart. And so they quit hiring. They put a hiring freeze, and you're only on that list for something like 18 months before you time out of the list. And I also didn't have a language, which would have maybe gotten me in a little sooner. So there are those types of jobs, and there's types of things where people will work for companies and then work their way up to become sort of an international representative, a little bit like what you're talking about, Brittany, gaining that experience and getting your feet on the ground and working for them at that level. For some people, it's simply traveling and continuing to enrich their own lives with travel. There's a lot of people who maybe envision themselves volunteering in various ways. Maybe it's disaster relief, maybe it's through missions with church, those types of things. There's all sorts of different opportunities out there to stay engaged. Also, I wouldn't rule out necessarily like going on to graduate school at some point, maybe even internationally. A lot of the cooperating universities we work with actually have English-speaking graduate level programs, not necessarily undergrad for grad. So there are tons of opportunities out there to stay engaged. And what I would like to have you all do now is sort of take a look, and there is a worksheet for this. I'll put it on the website, of course, but I am going to, where is it? It's here, okay. So, did I click? All right, so new share, does it do it? Sorry guys, technology. So there is going to be a website, of course, for this. Shouldn't it be on here? As far as an option to share. Oh, yeah, here it is. It just looks weird here. Okay. No? Yes. Okay, so this is now being shared. Whew, guys, that was tough. All right. Oh, now it's gone. Okay, so this is what the sheet looks like, and I have it summarized in the PowerPoint as well. I just wanted to show the people out there what this looked like. And what I'm going to ask is that you turn this in online. I'll put up a little assignment thing, but it's not necessarily for points. It's just that you actually, we're watching lecture, so kind of participation, if you want to call it that. Okay. Hi. Okay. We're going to come back in here just to make sure it's all good to go. All right, so we're going to walk through this exercise. So what I would like to have you do is sort of take a minute here and sort of think about what your best international life might look like for you moving into the future. So I'm not going to even put like a time frame on it. So for some of you, it might be like 3 years from now you're looking at it, and some of you it might be 10 years, and for some of you it might even be 20. But if you want to take the sheet minute and sort of write in what you sort of envision as your best version of a global life. And focus in on one idea. When you're finished with that, we'll jump into the 5 whys exercise. And that one, it's a little bit more specific. So what you're going to ask yourself is, why did I think this is sort of what I wanted to do? So it might be because I have a passion for it. Okay, so then for why 2 might be like, well, why is that my passion? And then if your passion is, I grew up with animals. Okay, well, why was that so important to me? So what you're going to do is dig down into, you're trying to go deeper with each why is the point here. And then the idea is that by the time you get down to the 5th why, you'll be at the heart of why this is something that is important to you. And then I'll talk about that once you're finished. So go ahead. It's typically like, don't try to think too terribly deeply about it. If you get stuck, it might be like a what question, or it might be slightly different. So, but 30 seconds, give or take, for each, on average. Some will be easy, some will be hard.
Thanks.
Yeah, do that. I know so many different ways you can go with it too.
Oh, yeah.
That's the hard thing. Depending on how you start, it could be really changing.
Exactly.
You can start them with the fifth one, and you want to start correcting that one.
Oh, yeah. You can use each one to branch off. No, where I wanted to go, that's.
I did the same thing.
And you thought,
Yes.
did you get to number three?
Yeah. Very much so, yeah.
Alright, so you guys, did any of you end up with any sort of revelation or something that sort of surprised you that you, at any of the whys that, oh, okay.
I feel like I kind of knew the first one, even the fifth one, it was kind of like branched into
Yes, exactly.
the middle. It's kind of what I go onto.
Did that help you learn anything though by looking at those middle pieces and how things sort of connect together? And something Cody and I were talking about is on, ours, it was sort of like, yeah, like I kind of knew where in my heart I wanted to go, but it was sort of like in the middle, I was kind of then surprised, like, oh, but if I answered number three, like the three question I had, it was going to take me in a different direction.
Yeah.
So I almost, when there's a little bit more time for myself, it's sort of like, maybe I need to go through this again and branch it out and have like multiple whys and then come down from there with multiple whys. But the point of this is then, of course, to help you sort of articulate and to really dig into why you're motivated to do what you're doing. And then also at the same time, even if, like, for instance, you hit a roadblock somewhere along the way and you look back at what your final statement was, is the goal that you wrote the only means of getting to, that number 5, like the fifth why, and what's that really at the heart of everything? Are there other avenues? So, and that's sort of what happens with a lot of students. There's the age-old, for instance, students who come in as being pre-vet in this college are, it's about 75 to 80% of freshmen coming in are pre-vet. The thing is, it happens a lot of time for those students is that they've only seen the veterinarian as being, like, in terms of the limited number of career paths they've seen. That's the only one they know of that sort of meets this, like, inner undefined goal in their heart. So working with them then to start to realize, no, there are a lot of different career options. And if you get to that fifth why and you can identify why it was that was why you wanted to do this, then you can go backwards then and sort of start to say, oh, but this career could lead to help me doing that, and this could help, and this could help. So, and I say that because I was one of those people 25 plus years ago. And I really just kind of saw myself hang out around like table, like talking to people and advising them. So I'm doing that, but there just isn't an animal on the table. And then we climb up on the table. Yeah. So then the next piece I want you to consider then is, what are you going to need in order to get to that goal? Is it additional education? Is it resources like money or support? Is it some type of credential? something that a lot of our students don't necessarily consider is super easy to get jobs abroad teaching English. So if you really want to get some international experience, especially in, for instance, Asia, China or Japan in particular, you can fairly easily get a job teaching English. But it's best to then have the credentials to make that happen. So that's why I put that in there. So I'll just take a couple minutes here and brainstorm what you're going to need to do or get for yourself in order to make your goal possible. And then feel free, these next points are kind of sort of more independent. So go ahead and sort of mark down who would you need help from. So is it going to be your advisor? Is it somebody you don't even know who that is, but maybe a title or somebody at a specific company or government agency? Write in who you would go to for support. When you're finished there, feel free to go on to the next step. Think of the timeline for it. You guys feel pretty good about it? All right, awesome. So these are for you to have and use as you need. Sort of have as like the start of maybe an action plan. But I do encourage you to sort of keep these in mind as you move forward, and don't give up on these types of things, because it's really fun. And a lot of times you can, even though like life changes and it goes different directions, it's even at the very least, it's nice to kind of pull this out and be like, oh, what were my dreams as a college student and that sort of thing. But it's nice to have as well, just because, like I said, once you come down to the fifth why, even if life takes turns and twists and that sort of thing, to be able to come back to that and say, okay, so this is something I'm passionate about, or at least was at one point. How can I find a way in my life to find an outlet for this? So it's good stuff. Okay. So the rest of the lecture then is sort of, it's getting into also from my leadership class that I teach. And they have what I thought was a really interesting lecture about how to work in terms of leadership at an international level. Not necessarily sort of like how do you climb the ladder and work for like the United Nations or something like that. It's more about, it's interesting because it got back into the cultural competency stuff. And so I thought it was a really good tie-in for this class, especially because some of you out there, whether it's going to be domestically working with international people or whether it's going to be going abroad, maybe trying to set up a study abroad someday, especially if there are people who've not really worked that much with the people from the US, understanding sort of how to think through things is sort of important. So, all right, so we started to talk about international teams and team culture. In order for things to sort of be successful, this is sort of an outline of ways to think about it. So shared perceptions, meaning like norms, roles, and patterns of interaction, it can vary pretty dramatically from country to country, from culture to culture. So the development of how things come together is also very important. So that early behavior in particular, those first impressions and how people interact, and making sure you do it in a way that is balanced from everybody's perspective, because you don't want to turn somebody off by not having, or by not being sensitive on that very first day. And we're going to jump into these a little bit more deeply as we go. So this is more just the intro slide. And then, of course, support and helping behaviors with people, and then training in the behavior that you expect out of people. So, and it's not just all about then taking people from abroad and making them act like Americans so that you understand. Yes, it makes it easier for you, but then it really doesn't provide much value in terms of why you're doing international work. And then also, it's important then to reflect on your organization's culture. So whether that be a school setting, whether that be a zoo, to reflect on that and really think about how that interacts with the community that you're going into, or who it is that you're trying to bring into your community, and how they might perceive that. So in order to do that then, defining your actual culture, what is it? It's within your organization, it's shared by all of the members. So you guys have a sense of what the culture of FAES might be? Like if you had to, you know, like, so the organizational culture does all of these things, but how would you describe the FAES culture? Community is something that's important here.
Boots and trucks.
Boots and trucks for some people, right? So I think what we might be doing now is getting into organizational subcultures. Because, you know, for instance, students from the School of Environment and Natural Resources may not say boots and trucks are part of their culture. Call me crazy, but that might not be something that would resonate with them. So
I think this is exactly our title for college, you know, food, ag, and environmental science. All three of those. Something that we all share.
yeah.
Very outdoor focused, like outdoor things, majors and stuff, based around outdoors, nature.
Community development.
Kind of work, yeah. Okay. I think something that sort of all of them share as well is sort of being separate, like from the rest of the university. It's something that is shared, like we kind of have our own space. In terms of maybe the university setting, maybe we are rural on campus.
For sure.
You know, and I'm talking about that sort of in a metaphor for central campus being like city. sort of a thing. But I think there tries to be at least a connection with faculty and staff and students, and in a lot of cases trying to sort of ensure that there's sort of personal relationships, not necessarily, I mean, in like informal personal relationships, but a personal connection between people as well. And that's something that would be important, I think, for instance, if we were to bring in like international students and try to enculturate them into understanding this college. You know, you have to think about those international students in terms of, for instance, they're number one, trying to compare to their home culture, where education might be very different, like very lecture focused, and like a lot of students from other countries will be confused when faculty are like, "Do you have any questions?" and wait for people to respond. You know, it's because they would never have a faculty member do that in a lot of different countries. So, and then you tie in, well, and then it's like this strange specific college that is like separated from everybody else. Like you have to take a bus or walk across the river to get there. And then once you get there, there's all these subcultures of, you know, outdoorsy people. But then there's the food science people who are like in their labs inside all the time. But then you go over to the Ag Eng building and there's big trucks, which are pretty much like a US, Australia sort of a thing, like some Latin America, but big trucks are pretty unique. First world. Like, and that's not even like a kosher term anymore, sorry. So it's sort of, it's interesting probably when you really start to think about our culture in terms of international students coming in for the first time. And that's sort of the way to think about if you're working for an organization that's hosting somebody internationally, or you're going to be going to another country to work with them, and to realize what are maybe your expectations or assumptions going in that need to sort of be erased to some degree while you're there. So, but how do you predict whether or not, like, so how do you set up the relationship and the culture to make sure that you ensure success? There's a lot of support and collaboration within those types of environments among the people. So there's, for those international students coming here, again, going back to that, support and collaboration. We have a lot through the global engagement team over in international affairs, but within the college, how might we do better in terms of encouraging or supporting and collaborating with international students? Encouraging involvement and participation, getting everybody involved so that everybody's, like a piece of everybody's culture, it becomes a little bit more spicy, a little bit richer of an experience because we have all of those different pieces and parts in there. And then also making sure that the norms are defined. So actually coming out, and it may seem sort of inorganic because when you're around people who share the same norms that you do, you don't have to say, it's okay when the professor says, do you have any questions? If you have a question, they really want you to ask. You might actually have to say that, where you normally wouldn't have to. So just ensuring that there is a lot of open communication and talking back and forth. So if you're going abroad and trying to set up a multinational company or something, you may have to lay a lot of groundwork, and it may be a couple months before you get really productive because you're having this opportunity to sort of set the norms and take into account what you're doing and what your expectations are and how you're going to design things in that country. And then moving on, then the different types of culture that people expect within different countries, it starts to pull in some of our cultural values that we talked about in the CQI stuff. So if there's a control culture, they might not be comfortable if you try to go in and not have a hierarchy. So if you try to do something that's sort of very flat because that's what's sort of in your own personal nature and you think that's best, it might create some chaos because people want you to come in and be, you know, that strong leader if you are the point person. So it's not that you can't eventually get there, but there may be expectations and a need for you to do that because the culture you're going into expects that. right? So, and then it's, like I said, it's difficult to operate teams unless you then incorporate that. So then another factor that takes into, that shapes the types of the organizational culture that you might step into or something, is the commitment culture. So once people have a commitment to the culture of the team that you're putting together, then you can start to work on some other pieces and parts. So once you have that, then you can start to reduce the level of hierarchy. You can start to focus on quality. You can convince people that that's what we're really trying to work on, rather than sort of having this, chain approach to asking somebody who asks somebody who asks somebody to come back down the chain to tell me what to do. And then continuing to encourage open communication and participation, and then empowering your sub-teams, giving them some autonomy to do some different things. But again, it's going to take some time. And these are sort of, actually what, I kind of conflated these, but if you go into a control culture, that's what it's going to be like. If you go into a commitment culture, it's going to be like the second type. And what, in the US, I think what we try to work toward, especially in sort of higher levels of education type work, is more the commitment culture. So you're leading people out of an intrinsic motivation versus an extrinsic motivation. So that's the top one. But so what you're going to have to do, though, is if you're going into a control culture, you might want to try to move it toward a commitment culture, but that takes a lot of work. That's where I'm going with that. Okay, so, but yeah, changing the culture then, right, it's difficult, it's a long process, and it may need to take place among different subcultures. So it might be then like one or two specific teams within the organization to change, but not the whole thing. So, so keep that in mind, and especially if it's a short-term thing, like something like the Peace Corps, where you're only going to be there for a couple of years or something. Know that you're not probably going to change it forever, like that community. So, but in order to be successful for the 2 years that you're there, you might need to create some of these subcultures within your organization that help move things along. So, because if you do keep it too much in the control culture, people aren't going to share the information that you need in order for your projects, for instance, to be successful. So for instance, going into maybe like a conservation area within Africa, you might have people who are used to this, to the control culture, but when you go in and then try to just keep it at that level, within that culture, they don't necessarily feel open to share their opinions with you. So you have to work really hard in order to build those relationships and that trust, in order for them to feel comfortable saying, well, what you're recommending isn't going to work. Yeah. So it takes a lot of groundwork to get to that place, because you're asking them to go into a commitment culture, which is not their nature. It might be their nature, but it's not their nurture. Yeah. So the three specific sort of cultural dimensions that come into play at an international level tend to be individualism versus collectivism. You guys remember that piece of it? And in the US, we're very sort of individualistic. A lot of Asian countries, for instance, are more like collective. A lot of African countries are more collective. And then also the power distance. The low power distance is that flatter hierarchy, for instance, whereas high power distance is, there's a mountain to climb before maybe you get to the person at the top who makes all the decisions, for instance. And then risk avoidance versus risk taking. So people willing to take risks with money, people versus people wanting to be sort of conservers of what they have or what they had. And it's not just with money; it could be with culture. It could be other types of resources in terms of people being risk averse or risk taking. So these are the three dimensions that start to come into play the most when you start to talk about that. So jumping into that more, and individualism, people feel more autonomy, there's more privacy. So it's, you don't tell people what's going on necessarily. Like if you're struggling with your garden growing and so your family's going hungry, if it's an individualistic type culture, You're not going to tell people, and that's a problem for knowing that, right? But if you can start to build teamwork, it can start to counteract that a little bit because the greater comfort level engaging, specifically in conflict, and healthy conflict is good. If there's absolutely no conflict, have you guys ever heard that said, for instance, about a marriage? Like, if you don't fight, the marriage is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
But you have to fight fair, right? So conflict is actually a good thing as long as it's fair conflict, right? And then resistance to teamwork. So there could still be some resistance to it because of the desire to be individualistic. But then once you can have some teamwork, it becomes more creative. So in a collective group, so of course there's going to be a lot of loyalty, belongingness, cooperation, but then there's disapproving of self-promotion. So for instance, if you try to, in the US, we might say, elect somebody as your leader or appoint somebody as your leader, or somebody take some autonomy or take some initiative to make something happen, that might be uncomfortable. So you're going to have to sort of work with people to say, I know you're trying to be collective, but I need somebody who's willing to sort of lead your group and make things happen. So, but within teamwork, then, if you can get it to take place, conformity, which can be good because there's a lot of norms, but then at the same time, you don't want it to be, you can go too far on the spectrum of conformity, and then everybody is too much the same, and people do things just for the sake of meeting the norm, not because it makes sense to them, for instance. And then also acceptance of self-management. So within the situation of teamwork, then people then do start to self-manage, which can be a very good thing. But then also self-manage from the standpoint of then assigning somebody to then take some leadership and help manage the group as well. Can be a very positive thing. So really what you're trying to do is build teamwork when you're in there, but keeping in mind, depending on the society that you go into, that could be easier or super hard. So the next dimension then in terms of power status, what does that mean? So they are status oriented. You might have people with titles left and right. They're empty. Right? So. And the problems that can then start to develop from that, of course, is people not being as creative, and then there's lower participation because I'm not at the status where I have a say yet. Yeah. So I'm just going to stay down here and wait for the trickle-down effect to finally hit me after the people make decisions up here. So with low power, though, it is more egalitarian, and everybody tries to be sort of equal. Again, there's some overlap, of course, with the individualism versus collectivism and high power, low power. There's some there's overlap in terms of like a Venn diagram and the behaviors with low power and collectivism, for instance. But it can be difficult to manage because everybody's trying to stay nobody's trying to rise above. So there can sometimes be more conflicts because everybody's trying to keep things maintained and sort of at this even playing field and kind of standard, like stable status that it is. And then it's hard in terms of them implementing solutions for your problems because nobody's willing to step forward and take leadership, for instance, in working those types of things out. So, and then of course, when it comes to risk avoidance and risk taking, then it gets to be a whole nother level of fun and excitement for that. So if the risk avoidant value like harmony and stability among each other, again, more overlap in terms of some cultures, and they want those rules and norms. They want you to tell them what's going on and how everybody's going to behave. In Western societies, we've adopted, for instance, parliamentary procedure. And actually then all of like the British colonies as well. So you can't even necessarily say Western culture because India has it and uses it at the governmental level. English colonialism, was rampant across Africa. So there's a lot of parliament going on there. But that's because then people value having rules and norms and knowing how our decisions going to be made, what's going to be said. It's like manners. everybody knows what you're supposed to do and what's going to happen. Risk-taking culture, though, they value change. They might value it too much. I want it to change quickly. Yeah. So it's action-oriented. Everybody's going to do something. So instead of having sort of a conversation that never moves because everybody's plotting and very strategic, you might have it where then somebody sort of mentions something on a whim at the meeting, and you come back for the next meeting, and 4 farmers have changed up their entire production strategy because somebody recommended something, or it just moves super quickly in those types of settings. So, and then conflict is viewed as a positive thing. So you might have meetings or interactions with people where there's a lot of conflict. So because it's just people talking in a loud voice, like working things out, and so if you don't know the language and you're just sort of on the outside looking in, like, what's going on? And I've been in those situations before where it's like, are they fighting? Like I'm like asking somebody else, like, and they're like, oh no, they're just talking things out. Like I don't know if they were just trying to help me feel better about it, but I was like, I feel like they're fighting. So, but then like just to compare to it, and the sort of proverbial comparison to the U.S. is Japan. That's sort of what's always used because they are so different than the United States. So, of course, in the U.S. And as a whole, individualistic, low power, flat hierarchies. We like to take risks, and then there's less teamwork as a result of those 3 cultural aspects being so prevalent here. But in Japan, there's collectivism. There's a high power structure. It's super, when they go into an office, you know who the highest ranking person is because they will be sitting right there. And then to the right will be the next highest person, to their left the next highest person, and you can go back and forth, knowing exactly how everybody, because they sit and they know when they go in what their rank order is. And then if somebody's not there and there's somebody moved up, it's like it's very specific. So, and then risk avoidance. But they stress interdependence. So what that means is that there are like quality is very much something that's considered to be part of like a circle of responsibility. Everybody is responsible for the quality of decisions, the quality of outputs that come out of that company. And at the same time, they very much is consensus decision making. So they might sit around a table for 2 hours discussing something that in the US, somebody might just be like, okay, let's call it to a vote. In like democracy, it's like, okay, like we're done, that we've talked about this as much as we can. Those in favor, aye. Those opposed, nay. Okay, the ayes have it. This is what we're doing. Move on. But that's not necessarily a super good thing because if you haven't had enough discussion and you haven't really thought through all of the different strategic possibilities, how do you know that the decision you're voting on is the right question to be being asked? So that's something to sort of keep in mind, is that it's not that like the US way is always the best way or anything like that, but at the same time, there are drawbacks to the way they do things in Japan, for instance. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of resources in terms of people's time, and then like the salary for these people who are involved. And because there's a high power hierarchy, the highest level people need to be involved in all of the meetings. Otherwise, the decisions aren't considered valid because that hierarchy wasn't considered. So keep those types of things. All right, so differences in the way people consider teamwork within individualistic cultures like the US. We use metaphors a lot of times. Like when we say team, a lot of people assume sports. It's not like that in other countries. Professional athletes in other countries don't necessarily make more than doctors or teachers or other things. So you keep in mind that here in the U.S., that is something that is very much part of our culture, is using sports teams as metaphors. That's when you're talking to people, it becomes important to keep in mind those types of things. Trust is based on a common team identity and also performance. So you trust people who look like you, who have the same ideals as you, And that's something that's also unique in individualistic cultures. Emotional expressions are amplified. We don't have very good poker faces in the US. When somebody is sort of stoic, it's something notable. You know, when it's like, I have no idea what that person was thinking, that becomes notable in our culture, right? And then team decision making is influenced by minority opinions here. So it can be like we leave it open to minority opinions. You know, we even have a vote where it's democratic. So we might vote that down, but that opinion is considered and allowed to be shared, even if it's a dissenting or a minority opinion. Okay. Within collective cultures, teamwork is also important. And we are almost at the end of time, but so we'll kind of wrap this up. But so the teamwork metaphors for them, rather than sports, it's more about family or communities. So instead of saying like I'm the coach and this person's the pitcher or the quarterback, you know, they say like, well, this person in this case is the father or the mother, and this is the grandma versus, you know, the auntie or the children. They would use those types of metaphors. And then like the social emotional relationships are criteria for team success. So it's not just about the bottom line and what the output is, but it's also about how many people are happy with this decision, how many people, like, is grandma happy? You know, like, did we hurt anybody in the process? You know, not something that we would necessarily consider in the US in terms of our bottom line. So trust is based on personal ties, not just sort of because somebody has a title. Emotional expression is oftentimes suppressed. You don't express yourselves. You don't, if you try to keep your facial expressions neutral, which I would die in a culture like that. And then decision making is very cooperative, and then it's conflict avoidant typically. So, so we have talked a lot about these, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to say it's to some degree fairly self-evident as you go through, looking at the slides and knowing sort of what they're talking about as you do. So, so problems within transnational teams to consider, for instance, culture distance, cultural identity, communication, and then what reward system you choose are all things that you want that are potential problem points that you want to sort of think through and be very strategic about in terms of making sure that what you're doing is going to motivate people and how they feel most comfortable within those situations. So training is huge. Having strong leadership and like in terms of motivation and providing direction and helping set those norms and communicating those broadly and with as much specificity as you can. And then oftentimes it's important then to develop a hybrid culture, not just be like, okay, it's a US company, but we're coming to China, therefore like we're gonna have US norms. It needs to be a hybrid, so. All right, so we rushed through those last few slides, but I hope in terms of looking at your goals and knowing what you want to do and potentially engaging internationally, it at least gives you a sense of, you know, a seed planted maybe in which you can then start to think about once you start to engage in these types of activities, or as you decide what types of credentials you need or who you need to talk to, you know, maybe you need to adjust it now that you've thought about it from a different perspective is sort of the goal. Okay. All right. So that is today, guys. Next week, it's going to be Dr. Flatness from AEDE. He works in international development, and so what I've asked him to do specifically is talk through the impact of higher education on regional development. So what is the importance of universities and people like you guys, as being university-educated people, going into the world and making a difference, and what does it mean on a development scale? All right. So go Bucks. We'll see you guys all later. And, it's going to take me a second, so I'm just going to keep smiling. Bye, guys.